The man and the woman are created in God's image, created for a purpose, to work, and they're created for fellowship. We see temptation. They give in. The flaw is not in God's word. The fatal flaw was that they listened to temptation. They listened to the voice of the tempter, and they fell. And then we have provision, the provision of grace. This is such a huge theme in God's word, and it's simply not true that grace is a New Testament doctrine. Nobody approaches God in the Old Testament except by grace. Nobody. The Old Testament is not a covenant of works, nor is the New Testament a covenant of grace without works. You see, even in Genesis, this is a very strong theme. As we've seen, God provides grace to Adam and Eve, protecting them, prophesying the Christ who would eventually come and rescue their descendants, and even ejecting them from the garden for their own good. We will see later that God protects Cain. When Cain should have died for murdering his brother, God protects him. God protects the planet, in a sense, in chapter 6 with the flood. You say, wait a minute, the flood destroys people. The ark, Noah. You see, God is actually saving mankind. Most of mankind had already destroyed itself, but grace shines through. In chapter 11, with the Tower of Babel, God protects us from ourselves by refusing to let us take all the glory and create a totalitarian state in the world. God protects us. There is grace. God comes down. He loves us too much to let us do what we were about to do. When God calls Abraham, there's tremendous grace, and we will continue to focus on this. Well, what are the suggestions for further study? Primarily, you'd want to look at Romans 5 and 1 Corinthians 15. An interesting place outside the Bible, though it's very speculative, is the epic poem by John Milton called Paradise Lost. And one interesting feature of this is that Adam is really torn. He's tortured. In Milton's understanding, Adam knows that Eve has fallen from grace, and he's trying to decide, do I fall from grace and join my wife whom I love dearly? Or do I stay with God and lose my wife? And he decides to go with his wife. It's very moving. It may not be correct theologically. I'll give you lots of suggestions for further study. For the commentaries, I would recommend, if you want a study based on the original Hebrew, the Word Biblical Commentary. And there are 2 volumes on Genesis by Gordon Wenham. The Daily Study Bible series, which is similar to the New Testament series by Barclay, very common, very popular, has a series on the Old Testament. And Volume 1, Genesis, is by John Gibson. And there's also the Tyndale Old Testament commentaries. And Derek Kidner has written a great volume on Genesis. All of this you'll find at the website, along with the spelling of the Hebrew words. Focusing on the children, I think there's a very simple lesson from Genesis 3. When we do wrong, we tend to make excuses, or we could say, point 1, when we do wrong, we tend to blame shift. Adam blames Eve, Eve blames the snake, you know. And point 2, that sin has consequences. And even though it's okay, and God will forgive us, there are still consequences. Adam and Eve still have to leave the garden. That's a very simple 2-point lesson. Hey, that could make a sermon for grown-ups too, but it's not bad for kids.